Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll wait just a moment. We'll let some more people join us and then we'll get started. All right. So again, welcome. My name is Meredith Nini, and on behalf of the University of Chicago Press, I'd like to thank you for joining us for this event celebrating the launch of Epidemic Empire, Colonialism, Contagion, and Terror, 1817 to 2020, a new book by Anjuli Fatima Raza Kolb. This event is presented in collaboration with the Seminary Co-op Bookstore and as part of our new virtual event series, By the Book, Smart Talk with Chicago Authors. This series aims to bring big ideas and smart conversation directly to you. We have some great events coming up, so please continue to check our events calendar. I'll include a link to that in the chat. I just wanted to share a few ground rules before we get started. This event will be about an hour long, and we will have time for a question and answer period at the end. So please feel free to place your questions in the chat, which I'll be monitoring. Feel free to turn your video on or off as you prefer, but do please keep your sound muted so that we can reduce any background noise. And then as a final reminder, Epidemic Empire is available for purchase through the Seminary Co-op Bookstore. I'll be posting a link to the book in the chat as well. And now I'll introduce our guests. Anjuli Fatima Raza Kolb is Associate Professor of English at the University of Toronto, where she teaches post-colonial literature and theory and poetry. Her academic research explores how science, medicine, natural history, and other kinds of colonial knowing reshaped literature, culture, economy, and politics. We're also joined by Leela Gandhi, the John Hawkes Professor of Humanities and English at Brown University. She is the author of The Common Cause, Postcolonial Ethics and the Practice of Democracy, also published by the University of Chicago Press, and founding co-editor of Postcolonial Studies and board member of Postcolonial Text. Thanks so much, both of you, for joining us. I'll turn the discussion over to you.
Thank you so much. Many thanks to Marina, to you, Meredith, and to Alan Thomas. I'm not sure if he's here today, for helping to organize this event, and to Leela, most of all, for agreeing to talk with me about the book. I'm especially glad to be here with you all at home with the press that made this book possible. Thank you for letting me be part of the family. I'll keep my summary of the book very brief so we can get to discussing and thinking together, because more than I expected when I sent in the manuscript, I'm still learning so much about the questions of this book, and we all are. Epidemic Empire is a study of metaphor at its base. How does the idea of contagion shift the borders of politics? How does it shape war, the justice system, our everyday speech? How is it shaped by the undulating bodies politic we inhabit and comprise? In New York, where I lived and live when the Twin Towers fell and all across the world, pundits and politicians spoke of an epidemic of terrorism, a plague of radical Islamism, an inhuman threat to Western civilization in the form of a contagious and vicious fanaticism. The war on terror is still, it cannot be said enough, our longest war. It has displaced 37 million people and killed at least 800,000 civilians. It has caused rippling catastrophes in Syria and Yemen, Afghanistan, Kashmir, Iraq, Indonesia, China, India, for Muslims and those perceived to be Muslim across the globe. Violence that was framed as both disease prevention and civilizational conflict in the Bush years became even more strongly associated during the Obama administration with prophylaxis and care. The rhetoric of the pathologized other went underground for a time, but the treatment of the threat as an epidemiological one did not. In fact, the framing of numerous policymakers in the years leading up to the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden in 2011 insisted time and again that we ought to approach the problem of terrorism through the tools of epidemiology, to think of our work not as war, but as medicine. At the same time, in the 20 years since September 11th, the other side of the metaphor, actually existing epidemics, was, to say the least, neglected. Although I began the book long before the COVID-19 pandemic, our moment has had no shortage of intersections with the research I did. At the start of the outbreak, anticipating a dramatic wave of COVID-19 following Eid al-Fitr, the Western media wondered whether Muslim gatherings would become super spreader events, and mosques in Salt Lake City and Missouri were vandalized and burned in apparent hate crimes. The same politicians who called for essential workers and the elderly to martyr themselves to the economy had pathologized Muslim martyrdom just years before. The conceptual and moral incoherence is staggering. The events of this week in Atlanta and in the US Capitol on January 6th have brought me back to some of my earliest questions about epidemics and insurgency. Today, we are not talking about a figural overlap. As in the late 1850s in India, we are talking about an actual and acute intertwining of pandemic and insurrection, one anti-colonial and one white supremacist. It's worth thinking more about what the shared condition of vulnerability brought on by a pandemic enables in terms of collective thinking, and what it enables in terms of reconceptualizing who counts as the body politic. Racist white Americans have reacted violently to understanding themselves as existing in the same space, pandemic space, if you will, as the rest of us. It is inconceivable to them. Anti-maskers, anti-vaxxers, pandemic deniers are saying many things, but one of the things they are saying is, I refuse the pan or universality of this condition. It doesn't apply to me. My body, white America's body, is not vulnerable. It is immured, immune. It doesn't need to hide behind a mask. To some extent, they are right. The medical racism in this country, to give a very complex set of factors a short name, has made, as you know, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people leagues more vulnerable to COVID-19. The breach of the Capitol was a ritualized performance of the immunity to police and the sovereignty, feet on Pelosi's desk, the seizing of the rostrum of the white, able, cis, hetero body. The hate crime mass murder in Atlanta on Wednesday exists for us, therefore, in a hermeneutic of phantom pain, what poet Franny Choi has identified in a poem published in 2019, and which she read again last night as, quote, the apocalypse before the apocalypse. By the time the apocalypse began, the speaker observes, the world had already ended. It ended every day for a century or two. It ended, and another ending world spun in its place. Everywhere the apocalypse rumbled, the apocalypse remembered. Our dear beloved apocalypse, it drifted slowly from the trees all around us, so loud we stopped hearing it. What are the universal aspirations or confessions of this we? It feels too raw to draw a direct line from pathological thinking, the relationship between race, gender, sex, and the criminalization of immigrants to this murder, but I don't need to draw it. The line is there. The Muslim ban has its prefiguration in the Page Act of 1875, the Contagious Diseases Act of 1864. The white supremacist state is built on social exclusion. In Epidemic Empire, I tell one of many stories about how we got here by rejoining the science of epidemiology back to its colonial roots in early 19th century India, following the waves of cholera that shaped not just the praxis of empire, but also defined its borders. I read big novels by Kipling, Stoker, Camus, Rushdie, but also unknown poems, tracts by colonial physicians, complaints by local hakims, films, sketches, memoirs, poems, the 9/11 Commission report, the Senate Intelligence Committee report on torture, the unclassified bin Laden dossiers, and more. Over the last few weeks of conversations about this book, I've been asked more and more about how I found the support systems to help me make a book that dealt so directly with the violence being visited on our communities in the name of health and care, a global good that never seems to reach us. The hatreds that shape our moment are not new. Those of us who are here today have been shouting it down for years. It binds us and makes us allies in this apocalypse, even friends. I'll end this brief introduction with thanks to Leela's work on friendship, work that has been central to my own friendships, the gestures, both minor and world building, that constitute the other side of the disaffiliative and the necropolitical discourses of identity quarantine, and its carceral archipelagos. These are lines I underlined in 2007 when I was a first-year graduate student from Leela's Affective Communities. They elaborate what might follow from a friendship that, quote, categorically defines community as a countermand against social exclusion. A friendship that is, quote, neither a settled arrangement from above nor one from below. The axes of utopian community are horizontal and latitudinal. On a day when this possibility seems as out of reach as it does necessary to survival, I want to open our discussion in the politically serious spirit of friendships existing and those to come. I look forward to thinking with you all today, and thank you, Leela, for being here to talk with me.
Thank you so much, Anjuli, for making it possible for us to have this conversation, and to Meredith for so generously chairing the event. I just have to say just how much I loved the book, and to take some time saying that quite uncritically. And sort of in an ungenerative fashion. But it was, I loved the range of it. I loved the writing of it, and I'll have hopefully more to say about that as we go on. And I want to say that it left me, I was pondering about the kind of sensations it was producing in me, the cognitive sensations. And they were kind of like the opposite of estrangement, or the opposite of defamiliarization, which is to say that rather than, in the way that political critical work often does, is to make what is familiar seem foreign. In fact, what you seemed to be doing constantly, page by page, sentence by sentence, was to increase this consciousness of what was already so familiar. Because in the most poetic way, you are writing about systemic bias. And that as one reads this book, and I invite everyone here to do so immediately, I just sort of felt this light and enlargement on things I felt I had known. And of course, at the heart of this is your extraordinary main theme, which is the link between Islamophobia, contemporary Islamophobia, and what you call the epidemic imaginary. So just to begin then, the way the book is organized in a literary fashion is already, so I want to start with the most most apparent aspects. The way it's organized, it seems, is through three main sites. So in backward order, let's say Kashmir, and when I say these three sites, I'm just saying what it does is it reorganizes the reading material of the Anglophone curriculum. So moving backwards, you have Kashmir, and at the heart of this is, of course, Rushdie's corpus. And then you have Algeria, Fanon, Camus, Pontecorvo, amongst others. And then, right at the beginning, you have the Ottoman Empire. And I really want to draw you out on this, because it's sort of scandalous how we don't think about anti-Ottomanism in our daily life. And, it seems to belong to some very hoary past, but of course it was a fraught issue right until after the First World War. And you give us, you pair anti-Ottomanism and this and Romantic Gothic. So suddenly, Coleridge looks different, Bram Stoker looks different, Mary Shelley looks different, Byron looks different because of Ottomanism. And then, of course, your cover image is key here. So just discursively, can I draw you out on your thinking about the Ottoman Empire, about anti-Ottomanism? And I'd love to hear about how you came across this extraordinary image, and let you talk about it, and I'll show it. I think I can't see myself, but I assume. Okay, yeah.
We can see you. This is. I'm especially moved by this question because it's not one that has come up very often. Actually, I think in part because it's kind of a separated area of expertise. Like the way that area studies has sort of worked in North America means that I'm not often asked, at least in context of literary talks about this history. The way that the Ottoman Empire lurks over the 19th century, especially Anglophone literary production, is so thoroughgoing. A catalog of it is an updated catalog of it. Let's say it's certainly there in Orientalism and in Antoinette Burton's writing to some extent, but an updating I feel is really necessary. It's not what I was able to do in the book, but there's another essay that I was researching alongside this book about Mary Shelley's novel, The Last Man, which is a plague novel. And actually a reader pointed out to me recently that in the article version, I made a mistake that the plague originates in the Nile Delta and then comes into its sort of full efflorescence in Istanbul. But I think, especially with the Romantic circle, or Byron and Shelley in their circle, the obsession with a kind of lyric revolutionary hinged really, really closely to the Greek Revolution, partly because of Byron's own service in the Greek Revolution, and that the kind of specificity of that fight against Ottoman incursion just there in the 1830s, I think, gave an extra, like almost turbocharge to the notion of a kind of broader terror of Ottoman, the sort of like bigger, more pervasive and vague Orientalism of the period, and that kind of turbocharge of the Greek Revolution and being on the side of that form of democratic self-determination gave the political energies of the Romantic circle something like what we might call like a pre-anti-colonial feeling, as if the Ottoman Empire was the evil monolith, right? And that kind of binary thinking lasts all the way through the First World War.
Of course. Well, you see, this is what's really interesting, because at the heart of all of this, and you get at it with the question of Ottomanism, is that that Islamophobia is also a kind of, that it can very easily construct itself as a kind of nut job anti-imperialism.
Yeah.
And I think precisely because the Ottomans are imperial, and you mentioned 1830s, and I mean, of course, I'd love to hear you ramble on this topic if I can invite you to do so. But what about the 1930s, where the figure of the Ottoman Empire is still kicking?
This is something I want to hear more from you about, because as you have noted in the architecture of the book, basically everything between 1919 and the mid-1940s falls out. So I'm kind
of course
with the First World War. But the persistence of the figure of the Ottoman Empire and then Turkey as the sick man of Europe.
Yes, of course. Well,
is central to this thinking. And you're also reminding me that another kind of big text that didn't make it into this book, but that lurks over all of my thinking is Karl Wittfogel's Oriental Despotism, which is this bizarre, like
know this.
massive study about how Oriental, I mean, we know this, right? The mythology of the Oriental
Yes.
monarch as dehumanizing, requiring the full submission and enslavement of its peoples, right? A worse kind of empire.
Yeah.
And I think those, in the years during the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, those mythologies stay pretty firmly in place. And they kind of, my reading at least, and I'm curious, Leela, what you think about this, but they slip quite easily into the terror of rising Muslim post-colonial states.
Yeah, no, totally. But you know, I mean, also what you're saying makes me think about the complexities of Islamophobia in contemporary India, you know. And, you know, of course, the mutiny is is where you kind of spark the inquiry. And the mutiny is also kind of the end of the Mughal Empire. And it's sort of unthought, unconsidered. It needs kind of critical therapeutic work, you know, and that it's always interesting in Islamophobia, you know, that this is a kind of phobia or a kind of racism of which abjection is not the only component, you know, that there is a kind of competitiveness and a kind of rivalrousness that belongs to this sense of competing imperialism, or, you know, I think.
The non-abjection part of things, especially in the Indian context, seems so clear when you spend some time with those, for example, these like 19th century taxonomies of Indian types, the mythology of the Pathan, for example, or the mythology of the Punjabi warrior, and how Islam, in a certain construction of British Orientalism, stands as a worthy foe in the context of the imperialism in South Asia. I mean, it's certainly a different discourse than the way Hindus are described in these texts.
Yeah. As we are talking, I realize that I will have to book you for hours to continue with every detail of this conversation that I had plotted. So I you know, we are running out of time, slipping between one's fingers, which is always a rare and wonderful thing. So just to I have so much to ask you, really, and I will actually, it's a prompt to be less verbose. So, okay, so can I talk to you about your lexicon?
Please.
So you, you know, in the trenchant work you're doing, you use these terms, you know, figural, habit, disease, poetics, epidemic, and pathogenic imaginary, and these are, you know, these are really powerful and capacious concepts, and of course, what they do, and you say that this is what they do, is they kind of they extend certain conceptual precedents, where, and I'll give these names, where, say, modes of abstraction, you know, thought language representation, have real world consequences, you know. And of course, this is crucial to postcolonial theory, and especially Inside's uptake of the notion of discourse, you know, to clarify, say, the proposition, you know, and this is postcolonial theory basics, that power operates through representation and culture as much as brute force. Besides postcolonial theory, you know, we could even cite Marxism 101, false consciousness, or ideology. But, you know, it also seems to me that antique systems of nonviolence per se apprehend that violence is only violence when it is somatic and non-somatic, when it is both of those things. So you're sort of, when I read your work, I see someone like you saying, well, I'm taking these ideas further. This is what I'm working with. And if I could ask you to reflect a little on your iteration, because it basically repurposes this entire conceptual apparatus. And it's, yeah.
My sincerest hope is that the work in this book modestly and simply extends those observations about the concrete consequences of figural language and of representation. I think that there were moments in the drafting where I was trying to do something more tricky or trying to make some super like intense intervention into how the mechanics of something like a theory of violence in Fanon works. And in the end, I don't make that intervention. I think that's an extremely not just adequate, but fulsome and perpetually useful way of thinking about, as you say, in antique, but then foundational postcolonial theories of nonviolence as being both embodied and representational, and never one without the other. And the example that I come to in the book, but also just talk with my students about all the time, is the one in which Fanon talks about violence as pure mediation in The Wretched of the Earth, and then immediately turns to an example of an Aimé Césaire play, right?
What does violence, sorry, go on.
No, please.
No, what does that mean, violence is pure mediation?
I mean, it's a mystery. I think.
What do you think? Because I'm very confused by that. And that's exactly the sort of thing you're talking about, I think, when you're talking about figuration.
I mean, one tradition that I wasn't trained in and most postcolonialists weren't trained in is the one in which figure is a mirror, so merely figure or mere figuration. And we never get to have that luxury, right? As postcolonialists, we never get to imagine that a figure is just merely a figure. I hear that in Violence is Pure Mediation. I hear it as a reflection back on the work of Black Skin, White Masks, in which to be an ontological subject is first to be perceived, and that there's no zero ground to stand on before that. And so what we count as the real in terms of anti-colonial violence is epistemic and physical and gestural, to borrow one of your keywords. And none without the other. I don't know. Does that feel like it would be amazingly fun to teach this text together, actually?
Yeah. No, totally. No, you see why I was intrigued is, I mean, I'm so preoccupied with this, exactly as you say, like the simple truth of discourse, the simple truth that violence can only be both somatic and non-somatic. It has to be both. And that, when you say it, I think precisely, I was struck by it because you put aside, when I said you bring consciousness to what is funny, you put aside all the palaver and were, and clarified the usability and the simple truth of that idea. And so I was particularly intrigued. There's a bit, I think it's page 41, and you're writing about the mutiny of 1857. And you say something very intriguing that, is just to take this conversation a little bit further. You say something like, the language in the 1857 mutiny, the language of natural disaster and epidemic is so ubiquitous that it ceases to register as figural. Now, what are you saying there? That's fascinating.
Something that I spoke with Gauri Vishwanathan about a couple of weeks ago is what becomes of this language that ceases to register as figural when it's taken a turn further and we're actually in a pandemic, and then it's has somehow even less metaphorical force because it's only literalisms on every side. But in that context, what I mean to suggest is something like what we've seen happen over the last year, which is that, and maybe this is connected to the first point that you raised, which is that the book really deals in truths that are extremely recognizable there's not a lot of moments of like mind-blowing, oh my God, I never thought that before.
No, that's not true. That's not true. There are plenty of those.
But no, but I mean, I think part of what I was trying to do is excavate a metaphor that almost was dead, right?
Yes.
So that epidemic stops meaning anything. It just means it's everywhere.
Yes, I see.
And that's and to try to be very literal minded about the relationship between epidemic and not just meaning something like it's everywhere, but in fact meaning something much more specific about how something moves through a population, what it is to imagine a pathologized subjectivity or a pathologized change of mind or change of heart.
Yeah.
Because in the post-mutiny era, the number of times that this crops up, your eyes sort of go right over it.
Yeah. Yes, of course. Yes. And so, I just want to, I'm just now picking out these questions. But just for those of you who haven't read the book and who will immediately, I just, in the vein, just to sort of clarify what it is that Anjuli does that is really extraordinary, is that apart from colonial discourse, apart from giving new teeth to colonial discourse analysis, she, Anjali, also really extends the power knowledge template that Said clarifies in Orientalism, that sort of ever since that book, there's been no debate about the power knowledge thing, but the question has been like, what kind of knowledge? And that's where the work has been. And until, actually even now, it's suddenly become clear to us, that knowledge is philology. And then, Siraj Ahmed said a few years ago, well, it's philology plus jurisprudence. And what Anjali does is say, it's epidemiology. And she says this as a humanist. And that is, it's epidemiology, but I'm going to think about epidemiology as a humanist. And that's sort of, is that a fair account of your intervention into the...
Yeah, I mean, in the strongest sense, just trying to be on the team of the history of the disciplines and that question of knowledge and power. But I also, Leela, I will want to talk with you about this again soon, but on the one hand, I think you're absolutely right that there's no debate about whether Said was right about the power knowledge nexus. On the other hand, graduate education, even at Columbia, and the profession as it is taking shape, particularly around our field, what has become world literature or global Anglophone, or these other completely toothless, to borrow your figure, versions of our discipline, I'm worried that there is debate once again about that Saidian.
Worried that there isn't debate.
I'm worried that there is now once again.
I see. Yeah. I see what you're saying.
Like that foundational thing of postcolonial theory seems to be called into question in a moment of like extreme depoliticization of our field.
Totally. And I have a big question about this for you, but I'm saving it for the last, and I'm keeping my eye on the time because I don't want to lose it. So while we're talking about epidemiology, you do this thing. You say, and so just to start this conversation about method, you say the epidemic is itself an archive. And I mean, just in terms of the kind of humanistic calibrations you do of public health science, and I think that's just a brilliant claim. And what it does, it seems to me, is that it allows you, and I think it allows you to shore up a range of incongruous figures. And I thought what it does is it kind of like it enlists the oxymoron, it enlists. And so one of the ways in which it seems to enlist the oxymoron is, and to point to the serendipitous nature of this book at this time, is that it allows you to bring the terrorist and the essential worker together. And can you say more about that?
You've made it sound truly insane in just compressing that. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to bang on about what I already know that many people in this room, take to be an extremely important set of observations about the last months that we all have made sort of independently or in conversation with one another. But the requirement that certain bodies are sacrificed to the normalized and normative economic temporality, the temporality of ceaseless profit, the temporality of non-cessation, if we could call it something like that. Those time scales and those pressures are the same pressures that drove company rule. They're the same pressures that turned entire portions of the globe into literally workshops for private corporations. And that, I think, to bring it back to some of the basic language of the book, it's those characters that are ejected from the body politic because they slow it down, or they infect it, or they produce a certain kind of noise or a certain kind of drag in the body politic, which is only oriented toward profit making and can never be oriented toward community, can never be oriented toward disability or a change in the norm. And I let me stop, because I think that this is a shared sense from everyone, at least whose name I can see on the Zoom today. So I don't want to preach to the choir, but I think that's what I was trying to get at in pulling those two. I mean, just to put a very fine point on it, for those of you who haven't read the preface, the language of martyrdom, as I also said in my introduction today, has just been repurposed for something that American working class people are expected to do in order for the God economy to continue. Just as, and I also think that this is important, just as the kind of low level subaltern workers of the imperial project were asked to sacrifice their own livelihoods and lives for, especially in this book, in the face of rampant tropical disease. Like, this was part of the discourse, but you owe it to, it's for the greater good. So this duty to sacrifice oneself or martyr oneself to the project of empire is being sort of redeployed in this moment of American discourse. And we're seeing it in every major city at the moment.
Yeah. And it's extraordinary also. This is a really extraordinary genealogy, and it must have taken just years of labor. I can tell from tracing that moment of epidemiology in colonial contact with tropical medicine, all the way to the epidemiology of terrorism, that as a WHO, like a category. And your account of the vaccination politics of Operation Neptune and the killing of Osama bin Laden is extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary.
As you say, it was both an incredibly laborious process and one that wasn't filled with many surprises. The logics are pretty firmly in place from the beginning of the 19th century to now. So just disturbing, deeper levels of disturbing, but not that many shocks. Yeah.
Anjuli, just like, two quick questions before the last one that I'm saving up. Another extraordinary insight in the book is that in your account of colonial epidemiological imperialism, you point to the way in which, and this is so enduring, that those who are afflicted are penalized and punished rather than cared for. And this is it's extraordinary. It also made me think of the Contagious Diseases Act and the penalization of women. Of suspected prostitutes, suspected sex workers, rather than these army towns of men, and this, and of course it's the history of malaria and ROS that you develop the cure on behalf of the invader. And that you make this very clear, that about this the inhumanity of epidemiological imperialism is in the denying of care to the vulnerable, but in fact not only the denial, it's not neglect, but the penalization. That's quite extraordinary.
The clearest example of this, in that, or at least the one that's been really sticking for me lately as I've been thinking about parts of the book, is the very specific way this plays out in the Algerian revolution, in as much as both torture was called medicine, like doses of medicine, by the paratroopers, and one of the most crucial ways in which the French paratrooper forces in Algiers were making headway against the FLN was by ensuring the denial of care for anyone who was shot in any kind of engagement. Basically, if you were shot, you were ratted out as a known FLN member. And so to go to a hospital was to get yourself put in prison for a different kind of medicine than the one that is named by the industry of care that's taking place. And I think that's been one of the more crushing memories of being in this archive, is the invitation, the constant insistence that we're here to take care of you, and then we'll shoot you for your desire for freedom, and then refuse to bandage your wound and instead send you to prison for torture. It couldn't be more clear and more cruel.
Yeah. Shoot you because you are wounded.
Yeah.
Also, and the ramifications of that in a number of contexts, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to try this question because I think we have to. It's not clear in my head.
You've built this up so much. I want us all to put this like party hat emoji now on our.
Okay,
Somebody called it the cornucopia of joy recently.
Okay, and this is a real question, and I know it has to do with something that I know I suffer from. I don't suffer from, but something I wrestle with, and it has to do with a sort of apologia about method in postcolonial writing. I've started doing it in spades, and it's really tiring. It's actually, it's getting to be hard. And I noticed you were doing it too. So I just, I ask you this because you are, of course, a writer across mediums. You're a poet and a critic. And I must say that I read your beautiful poem, At Allah, as a companion piece to this book. And I was hoping, I don't know, that we had time for you to recite it, but who knows? Inshallah. So many times in across your book, especially at the beginning, then in the middle, and at the end, you say this thing, and I'm saying I do it too, and I just want to think about this with you. You say, okay, I'm doing this, but I'm not doing this. So I'll just lay out some examples. You say, okay, so this work is large scale. Okay, it's not like traditional literary histories. It's not limited to periods, but the histories are non-contiguous. It's large scale, but the histories are non-contiguous. Then you say it's non-homogeneous. It's non-homogeneous, but there are networks.
Mm-hmm.
And then you say, citing Tagore, this is a historiography. It's wide, but it's not meandering. Then you say, look, this is history, but it's also literature. And I do this sort of thing all the time, anxiously, in a way that many in other. So, what you are not doing is saying things like epidemics are, or the wound is.
Mm-hmm.
That you are exercising a sort of hesitation that is not there in a certain kind of scholarship. Let me take a hero, Foucault, for example, who will simply say power is power, and then give you some examples from a French archive. So
some of which are false and some of which are true.
that bit I don't mind. That bit I don't mind. But do you know that there is a sort of, let me say that it seems to me that what you clarified was that there is a kind of renunciation of universalism.
Mhm.
But clearly there are costs, and clearly there are gains. And I want to hear what those are. I mean, what is it? Would you like, I fantasize about it sometimes, or to write a sentence like, music is, I mean, do you, is that a desire for you, or is it not a desire for you? It's clearly, there's an agonism here, which is a work on a critical self. So what is that work you're doing? Does it hurt? Does it pay off?
I love this question. I wish we'd been having this conversation for 10 years. I mean, it's also really on my mind, and Meredith, not to put you on the spot, but like it's drawn into conversations that we've had also about like what the book is, and what it can be, and moving between genres as a writer certainly has allowed me to imagine that there are spaces where I can say Allah is, or God is, or my grandfather is,
Yeah.
and moving between poetry and essay and scholarship, or at least breaking out in those modes, really helped me stop doing some craziness in my scholarly writing. On the other hand, what you're noticing is, I think, two things. One, very personal, and that's just a sense of first book anxiety about what counts in the field. And the second, I think, is a more institutional answer, which is, to some extent, this is evidence of what I understand to be a subfield increasingly under market pressures. So it's a kind of defensive tennis game that is a record, let's say. Each one of those sentences is a record of having been approached with the kind of condescension and disbelief from senior faculty members, largely white faculty members who don't have expertise in this field, and who had no idea how to manage evaluating work or understanding work that was being made in this mode. And so it's incredibly defensive. And of course I dream of a day when, not just, to kind of connect the two sides of this, the personal and the more institutional, not just a day when I'm established enough to make statements, from my nice, institutionally safe position, but when the field has dropped its fantasy of scientific precision and started instead to say what it's doing and to allow the kind of work. I mean, I have on my desk this gorgeous book, Dear Science, the Catherine McKittrick book that a number of you have heard me talking about recently. And it's so methodologically experimental and so communal in its gestures. And why isn't this just the kind of work that we can make without making excuses about it, in order to get through tenure or to be on a job market? And I don't mean to be intellectually unserious about the question that you're asking, because I think it's a profound one, but I also think it's really institutional, and I think it's really practical.
So you think the field is overburdened by an anxiety about scientific precision?
I think it is.
And does that take the joy out of your work, or you've outsourced it to poetry, or you've somehow managed to work around it? Or
I think at this moment in March 2021, I think I could probably write the book without those phrases. But the book is also the first book is also a vehicle to job security, and I think that they did the work that they needed to do in the systems that they were sort of speaking to. But no, I have to say it didn't ruin it for me. I said recently in a graduate student seminar that I am pretty easily activated by spite. So this is like, it's okay for me to feel a little bit embattled in the field, and to feel like a responsibility to postcolonial criticism at a time when I see it, on my other side of my job as a person who's making hires and writing job ads, seeing it being squeezed out by these other ways of thinking, which are so much more about a consumerist model of identity literature that I think, is really ruinous, frankly. Given the political extremity of the moment that we live in, I don't see how anybody could believe otherwise. But English departments are still have a lot of work to do.
True. Thank you, Anjali. I think we should allow Meredith to silence us. Meredith,
Meredith, silence us. Thank you.
Well,
for the question.
rather than silence, I would like to invite our audience to submit their questions via the chat, and we can continue the discussion from there.
I'll also say while you all organize your unmuting and your hands that it's so nice to see so many of you here, friends and former editors, and it's very exciting, and new friends.
I mean, I don't think that the anxiety you're talking about necessarily goes away. I see what you're saying about it being a first book thing, but it is something about the field, and I think you put your finger on it in talking about, this desire for precision, this desire to be right, or the need to be right, and arresting, and a kind of a sense that it is important to arrest the desire to generalize or to speak for others, or to,
it's the one, to me, it's the one great thing that remains about deep, big, slow scholarship, is not actually having the pressure to create. Although, like, what a dream to be so free as like actual Foucault, but still there is a relief not to have to say, like, to oversimplify things, and to make, I also had I'm very curious what you think about this, but I had run-ins with more agonistic, argumentative styles, advisors and teachers who really desired that kind of extremely bold statement. Pick one. Is it this or is it that? Is the figural language causing the material harm, or is the material harm causing the figural language, right? Like these kind of make it bolder, make it stronger. And that just didn't always get at the accurate thing. And so it's one thing that I still believe scholarly writing is wonderful for, is that
so true,
more indecisive stuff almost.
So true. It's really about being rigorous about that indecisiveness. Here we have a question.
Yes, thank you. So Kazia asks, well, first she says thank you so much and that she's looking forward to reading the book. She wants to ask about Ottomanism. You're so right that it is understudied. She was curious of your thoughts about Ottomanism and the complex position Turkey occupied in Islamophobic rhetoric in the 2000s as this model secular state, etc., especially with the turn to neo-Ottomanism in the Turkey in the late 2000s.
Absolutely.
Kasia, this is an amazing question, and I hope that if it's not asking you too much, that maybe you'll unmute and say a little bit about your thoughts about this, because I don't have probably anything useful to say, except that this question is a confusing one, in the sense that the secularism and the neo-imperialism don't seem to fit together the way that I would expect. So I'm curious, what do you think about it? Can I, is it okay to ask?
Sure, yeah. I don't know that I have that much more to say about it either, other than just kind of being fascinated by it and curious about it. I was also thinking, I was intrigued by, as Leela was describing kind of the structure of your book, that in Algeria, you're talking about Fanon, and in Kashmir, you're talking about Rushdie. But then in the Ottoman context, you're talking about British writers writing about Turkey, right, and the Ottoman Empire. And I've just been thinking to myself that this is a kind of ongoing thing in kind of the need for a better understanding of Ottomanism and Ottoman studies, is that we don't actually kind of read works from these places very often, right? I mean, it's really rare. But the question about neo-Ottomanism and kind of Turkey in the 2000s is just that, you know, as I think you probably know, I got a job in Turkey in 2011, and so suddenly started noticing all of the ways in which Turkey was kind of being talked about as, oh, it's this secular state, and they really kind of reconcile secularism and belief in Islam, and they're going to be partners with Europe, and you know, so all of this kind of positive dynamic. And then, you know, as Erdogan kind of consolidated power more and more, you know, then it became actually kind of like, oh, maybe Turkey isn't doing it right, and maybe we don't like them anymore. But it's still, it doesn't, you know, it still has a kind of exceptional status, I think, within Islamophobic rhetoric. And I feel that, you know, in the West, there is this sort of like, nobody is really sure what to do with it. So that I just was wondering if you had kind of grappled with this.
And it's inflected by colorism in the Muslim world and wealth distribution in the Muslim world. Like these are questions I don't know much about, but they're certainly just like observations at a distance. I think the other thing that I just put it in the chat, but I think Gloria Fisk's new book has quite a lot to say about this. And I wonder, I mean, one thing that I just felt completely overwhelmed by and didn't make it into the book was what is the exact shape in the conversations and in the documents of a neo-imperial fantasy on the shape of the Levantine Empire. In other words, the transition from ISIS to ISIL, what kind of histories are those, to some extent, Ottoman histories that are being redeployed in the 21st century? It's something I just felt like I couldn't cram into an already crammed book, but it's certainly a question that has preoccupied me quite a lot, taking up a certain kind of, I mean, another way to think about it, and Leela, I really was thinking about your work when I was thinking about these questions, is what's the relationship between that kind of 21st century imaginary of an empire and transnationalism? Like, I don't mean to be perverse, but is there something that we could say about the relationship between ISIL and Bandung, for example? I mean, let me just say, gone haywire, but those aren't utterly different shapes. It may be the kind of ugly gesture that brings the terrorist and the essential worker together, but at least as a question.
Can you say more, just another sentence or two about that?
I mean, I think the fantasy of a transnational or a global Islamicate
Yes.
doesn't only belong to ISIS. I mean, that's what I'm basically trying to say.
Yeah. Yes. Well, you know, I mean, that's the phobia in Islamophobia, is the phobia of the network.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's the phobia.
It's the phobia of the network, but I think also of the inscrutable subject.
Sure.
Who has to be invisible in order to be a network rather than a.
Of course. Everyone prays in the same direction. You know, those tropes.
Even images of the Kaaba, right? And swarming.
Exactly, swarm. And always those shots taken from behind.
Yeah.
Of prayer. Always. I mean, astonishing. Yeah. Anyway, lots more questions.
All right. One more question here. If the epidemic is itself an archive, then what is the work that the literary does for you? There's such a wonderful proliferation of genre in the book. Do they manage the epidemiological impulse, give form to both embodied and representational violence? Do these different genres offer a flash of insight in the Benjaminian sense and allow us to focalize these epidemic archives?
It's not an imprecise question, Kalyan. Thank you for asking. I think I just want to say I am not so precious about the literary. So I don't know that the literary does all that much for me, except as a kind of approach. But an approach that in my own training was, as Leela pointed out earlier, just deeply Foucauldian, which is already raising questions about what is the literary and what isn't the literary, what is the archive and what isn't the archive. But maybe a belief in the kind of creative, by which I mean the like the directed toward materiality power of language. I am a sort of deeply a literary person in the sense that I believe that that moves that way, even as it moves the other way. So what work the literary does for me, I think, is methodological. It just trained me to be a good reader. And then maybe the other thing I'll say is that doctors' reports from the International Sanitary Conference of 1850 don't circulate in the millions, and works of literature do. And so I kind of just think of them as a hinge phenomenon that carries a certain kind of minor discourse into the bigness of global common sense. I don't know if that's an adequate answer to your question. Probably in a different mood, I would say something more generous about the literary, but I don't know. I try to read everything as in a Catholic fashion. That's it.
I was just asking if I could just quickly respond. I was just asking that question, particularly because of how you were sort of gesturing to the kind of toothlessness of the global Anglophone and, you know, the world literature sort of questions. And what I find sort of so wonderful and kind of refreshing and important about your book is, of course, how you're, you know, asking us to attend to the power of the post-colonial in that sense, right? Like, in how you, by reading epidemiologically, you're asking us to take seriously these sort of, as you gestured in the conversation, the sort of importance of those fundamentals of post-colonial theory. So that's partly, I mean, I see the kind of generic proliferation also as kind of asking us in some ways to be better readers, as you were saying, and that's sort of what I was interested in.
Yeah, I think this question comes back to what Kasia was mentioning earlier as well, about like, what are the, and I take the point, like, what are the objects that I'm reading in this book, and why are they not, for example, the material from the Ottoman perspective? And that's a much longer conversation, which I'll summarize by just saying this book is a study of power, and it's, I hope, one of a number of big studies that I get to do. But I also, that question of what is post-colonial criticism, like, is it attentive first and foremost to the literature produced in places that have achieved independence only in the era after which they've achieved it? Or is it a method? And to me, there is nothing useful about policing when, where, who wrote it. That's not post-colonial studies. It is an approach. So we don't have to adjudicate geographies and temporalities and so forth. I'm not sure how others here feel about this. I mean, I would really welcome, again, a further conversation with all of you on this topic. But thank you for raising it.
All right, well, it looks like that's all the questions in the chat, and we have hit the hour mark. So just to be respectful of everyone's time, let's wrap up our discussion. Thank you both so much. This was a really wonderful, thoughtful discussion, and many thanks to our audience for joining us today. I'm going to include one more link in the chat to purchase the book from the Seminary Co-op. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Leela, for being here from London, and thanks, Meredith, from Chicago.
Thank you, Anjali. A real pleasure and privilege. I look forward to ongoing conversation. Thank you. And thank you, Meredith.
Thank you.